Now, in the latest issue of Marvel's Star Wars comics, issue number 2 of the second volume to be exact, we're beginning to learn Maz Kanata's good story for another time about how Anakin's lightsaber, or as some call it the Skywalker family saber, ended up in a box in the basement of her castle as seen in The Force Awakens, where it of course seems to call out to Rey and in some way is responsible for showing her a Force vision. And though I doubted then, as I continue to doubt now, especially after reading this comic book, more on that in just a minute, that it would actually be a good, reasonably believable story, because let's be honest, that lightsaber should be long gone, lost somewhere in the swirling gas clouds of Bespin. Anyway, though I had my doubts about just how good of a story it'd actually turn out to be, I wasn't really all that upset about not getting any sort of explanation for it right there and then in episode 7. Nor was I really all that upset that none of the sequel movies ever gave us the story either, because one way or the other, knowing how it got into Maz's possession likely wasn't going to have any true bearing on the story. Plus, realistically, it would almost certainly have to be a long, silly, and convoluted story that the movies didn't need to waste their time on. Though, when I think about it, I suppose I would have preferred Maz sharing a story in The Last Jedi about how she got the saber, over the only thing she did do in that movie, which was send our heroes to Canto Bight, which was a bigger waste of runtime than any convoluted story about a lightsaber could have been. Anyway, as I said at the start, it seems like we're going to get that good story now, and it all starts with Lando and Luke talking, and this all takes place shortly after the events of The Empire Strikes Back, and Luke at this time is upset about, well, pretty much everything that just happened, and Lando tells Luke that he knows Cloud City so well, that he knows where Luke's lightsaber would have fallen. And I can only hope that, since in this comic Lando wants to go back to Cloud City for his own reasons, he's just completely BSing Luke right here. Because I don't care how well he thinks he knows Cloud City, there's no way of knowing with any degree of certainty where exactly that thing would have ended up, which Luke should realize since he had an intimate experience with the inner workings of Cloud City. I mean, sure, you might be able to make a somewhat educated guess based on where other things have wound up that fell down this massive shaft before, assuming stuff, for some reason, falls down there often enough to make such a guess in the first place. But it's not like Lando should know the city that well, because at best he's been there a few years. Rebels clearly establishes that he's playing with puffer pigs as of like 3 years before the events of the original trilogy. And theoretically, I'd think it should have pretty much ended up in the same place Luke did when he fell. In the movie, we even see what I've always assumed, at least, was Luke's hand and or lightsaber falling into the clouds below him when he was just hanging there. Also, and I could be wrong about this, but it seemed like when Luke was in the tube after falling, there was some type of automated response that detected debris and opened up to jettison it out. So if Lando thinks it's in one of these tubes, which is my guess, wouldn't he think it just got jettisoned out too, or was it too small to trigger this automated response? But I guess it doesn't really matter one way or the other, because it's not going to be anywhere Lando thinks it is, assuming again he's not just messing with Luke. And that's because, believe it or not, somebody actually caught the lightsaber as it was falling. But wait, it gets even better because it seems to be someone who somehow knew not only that it was going to fall, but was also in the exact right place to catch it. And either this is the person who taught Lando all about where things land when they fall down this massive shaft and he just waits there to catch stuff, or this mysterious person, their identity was not revealed in this comic, had to be force sensitive for multiple reasons. Because first of all, they'd have to have some pretty crazy foresight to know it was even going to fall in the first place, that Luke's hand would be lopped off and he'd lose his saber down the shaft. And second, this person would almost certainly need force pull or something in order to actually catch it. Otherwise, they somehow knew the exact right place to stand to catch it as it was naturally falling. But don't worry, the mystery figure does indeed seem to be force sensitive and may even retroactively become important to Luke, because they say to him, oh, I forgot to mention, Luke is seeing all this in a vision when Lando brings up the lightsaber. Anyway, they say to Luke through this vision, after catching his lightsaber, to follow your destiny. And though I have plenty of questions after reading this comic book, here are my biggest ones. When, why, and how did this lightsaber suddenly become so important? I don't know about you, but before The Force Awakens I never thought there was anything special about it, and I still don't, honestly. Sure, I love that in Revenge of the Sith we see Obi-Wan pick it up after his battle with Anakin on Mustafar, but at no point in that trilogy is it ever implied to be something special, outside of lightsabers in general being important to Jedi. Nor is it anything special in the original trilogy. In A New Hope, it's just presented as the saber that Luke's father once used. I never ever got the sense that it was somehow the Excalibur of lightsabers, that there was anything special about the actual saber itself. Even in The Force Awakens, I don't know that I ever thought it was anything all that special. I just initially assumed it was the Force Ghost of Anakin, or all the Force Ghosts maybe, that called out to Rey through it somehow, so that she could or would find Luke Skywalker and give it to him, simply so that Luke would understand this girl was important and had been sent by them for a reason. Furthermore, I thought it'd be interesting if Luke hadn't seen or heard from any of the Force Ghosts for some reason since Endor. And this, Rey showing up with the old family saber, was his first sign that they, the Force Ghosts, were still out there somewhere. But for some reason, they couldn't communicate with him, but had been able to briefly contact Rey, again, likely thanks to the saber. And hell, they could have had it where, when Luke takes it, he too has a Force vision of some kind that we, the audience, are not initially privy to. I don't know, that may have been a slightly better way to kick off The Last Jedi. But I digress, and really here, I don't know that how Maz Kanata got the lightsaber actually needed to be a good, intricate story at all. It could just as easily have been that Maz said it was a good story for another time, because it wasn't, and Han, who she said it to, not to mention us the audience, wouldn't get anything from it anyway. It wouldn't add anything to the story. It could just be her way of dismissing the question because there was really nothing to tell. Because maybe the true story is the lightsaber was just found by some random technician on Cloud City who may or may not have understood what it was, and they sold it to someone who sold it to someone else at some point, and eventually it ends up in the hands of some poor schlub at Maz's castle, claiming he's got the lost lightsaber of Luke Skywalker, though maybe he doesn't even believe that anymore, and since he finds himself broken down on his luck, he shows it to Maz, gives his story, and asks what she'll give him for it. And she, somehow realizing what it is, that he's telling the truth, and feeling generous, gives him a small fortune for it, believing it to be good luck or some sort of sign from the Force that it's wound up in her possession, that there's a reason it's come to her, which turns out, maybe there was one, or maybe it's all just dumb luck. Doesn't matter either way, because Luke's just going to toss it away anyway, before it then gets split in half and finally buried at the Lars homestead on Tatooine, likely so that someone can dig it up in the future when Disney digs up the Skywalker saga and makes episode 10. And so instead of keeping things with the lightsaber simple and maybe somewhat believable, they had to make a huge grandiose story where none was actually needed, which is the MO for the other sources of canon, being given scraps and leftovers from the movies and told to do something with them in order to get people to buy books and comics that rarely tell interesting stories, that do little more than give you filler info that, honestly, no one really needs, other than the people like me who just enjoy knowing everything about Star Wars for some reason. Because really, why and how would someone be there to catch this lightsaber as it fell? That might be the silliest thing I've seen yet in the new canon, and granted, I don't know where they're going with this, what they might be doing with it, and Charles Soule, who is writing this, is usually really good with Star Wars, so maybe I'll end up liking it in the end. But if it's really going to be this epic, important, and intricate story, then maybe it was a good story for the movies to explore, not a story for another time, like a comic book. The problem with that, though, is it would have required those writing the script, that being J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan, to know the story of the lightsaber ahead of time, because, let's be real here, one of the reasons Maz tells us it's a good story for another time is because the writers didn't bother to think one up. All that likely mattered to them was it would make for a cool scene in their movie. Someone else could figure out the logistics of it later. It wouldn't even surprise me if they laughed and literally said at the time, someone else can figure it out later in a comic book or something. And there seemed to be a lot of that in the sequel trilogy in general. A lot of making stuff up without thinking or worrying about the ramifications or where the story would go next. The philosophy of those movies really did seem to be, I'll do what I want and someone else can fill in the gaps that I leave later. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Did you read this comic? And if so, what did you make of it? And whether or not you've read it, how do you feel about the Skywalker saber being turned into something important or special? Did you ever think of it as being special before the sequel trilogy? Do you think of it that way now? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.